You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by BBBGive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by BBBGive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator and your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities.
I'm Art Taylor, your host, and our guest today is without a doubt one of the most accomplished living Americans. She is the recipient of numerous honors and awards and is on the Forbes list of the 100 most powerful women. She is a medical doctor who has spent more than 30 years leading public health initiatives, specifically addressing HIV Aids with institutions such as the Centers for Disease Control and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she directed the foundation's HIV, TB, and reproductive health program. She was the head of care for 9 years and is heavily steeped in international relief work. She was also CEO of McKinsey.org, and now she heads the Chicago Community Trust, which is taking on race-based economic inequality in the Chicago region. We're going to talk with her about her amazing life to uncover what inspired and motivated her to this incredible life of service. I am pleased to bring to you Dr. Helene D. Gayle. How are you, Dr. Gayle?
Hi, thanks so much. It's wonderful to be with you, Art.
Dr. Gayle, your life has been one of impressive and inspiring achievement. So as to inspire others and provide a bit of role modeling, tell us how Helene Gayle, the young girl growing up in Buffalo, New York, became one of the most influential and service-oriented people in the country. Tell our listeners anything about your early life that pointed you to this amazing life of service.
Well, thanks for that. And, I guess for all of us, where we come from and the things that we learned growing up really do help to shape our lives. And I feel like I was very fortunate to be born into a family that felt that giving back was a part of what we were put on this earth for. My parents stressed to all five of us that it was important for us to get a good education, but that we should also use that education in a way that could contribute to making the society a better place and create positive social change. I also feel fortunate that I grew up in a time in the mid to late 60s when there was so much social change going on in our nation and around the world, whether it was the civil rights movement, women's liberation struggles in Africa, anti-war, all of these sorts of things, large movements where people were coming together to create positive change. And so for me, as a young adolescent growing up during those times, it gave me the sense of wanting to be part of something bigger than myself. And I saw how people banding together could create really powerful social change. And so I think those two things, my family influence, the influence of the times that I grew up in, really did have a huge impact on me wanting to be able to be part of creating positive social change.
As I think back to my own life, I can think of specific moments that sort of set me on this particular path, one of which was growing up in the YMCA movement and having great men around me who sort of shaped what I would become. As you think back, are there specific relationships or activities that you engaged in or moments that you can think back to that sort of shaped you in some way that maybe you didn't even understand at the time?
Well, when I think back, particularly during my high school days, I was very involved in both student government at large, but also with the Black Student Union at the time. And I think those two, being very involved in kind of student government and really, again, being around people who were trying to create in our own environment positive change. I also grew up in Buffalo around very nurturing and influential Black professionals. So I saw people who were lawyers and doctors and judges and councilmen for the local district, and you know had that group of elders around me who believed in me and my friends and really wanted to make sure that we had that sense of what was possible and that we believed in ourselves and believed that we could accomplish great things. And so I think having that village, if you will, that helped to nurture me and give me a sense of what the possible was, made a big difference for me as well.
As you think about young people today, do you see that same orientation to service and giving? And if so, how can we do more to continue to inspire that and encourage that?
Well, I'm actually quite inspired by the younger generation, and as I have advanced on in my own career and age and look back, there were some generations that I think really got the message that it was all about what they could accumulate, how they could arrange their career, and it was very much more of a me focus. Today, this next generation is coming along, perhaps because of the challenges that they grew up with, do seem like a generation that is very socially aware, very global in their concepts, thinking about the big challenges of the day, whether it's racial justice, climate change, and the environment. All of these things that they realize if they don't make an impact, the world as they know it is not going to be a safe place. And so I actually am quite encouraged by the young people. I look at the many of the protests that took place right after the murder of George Floyd, that were peaceful, that had young people of all races marching because they believed that they had a responsibility to say that they wanted a different kind of society, a society that was more just, more equitable, more fair, and more racially integrated. And so, that really was inspiring for me to see those young people who really do believe that they have a vision and a voice in making the world a better place, and particularly one that is more racially just.
In your case, you leaned in the direction of medicine. Was there a specific influence that you had that said to you, I think I'll go into the medical field? And certainly that is one of great service to help people with their lives. But you could have chose law, you could have chose education. Why medicine?
Well, when I was growing up, we didn't have the range of professions that young people have to choose from today. You kind of, if you wanted to have a profession where you felt like you both could pay your bills and make a contribution and have the ability to, perhaps because of the level of profession, be influential in your society. You became a doctor or a lawyer, maybe maybe a teacher. But I laugh and joke and say I had two sisters who went before me who became lawyers, so I said I'm not going to do what they're doing. I'm going to carve out my own path. But honestly, I felt like I wanted to have a career and a profession that did allow me to give back and to impact something that really made a difference for people. And I felt that health was clearly a cornerstone. As people say, if you don't have your health, you don't have much of anything else, and health is wealth. And so, I just felt that being able to make a contribution for something that is so core as health would allow me to do some of the things that I wanted to be able to give back to society.
Well, and you not only got into health, you got into more what I would consider to be public health. That is this larger, more policy oriented way of giving service. What drew you specifically to that? And I also see that you spent a lot of time focused on HIV AIDS, and thank goodness for that, because we certainly needed people doing that. How did you shift sort of to that as more of your specialty?
Well, I trained as a pediatrician and I
Mhm.
spent time practicing and learning how to take care of individual patients. Probably two things influenced me to move in the direction of public health. First, I saw patients come in and out of my clinic or in and out of the emergency room and realized that, what brought them in was not necessarily just their disease state, but it was the fact that they were influenced by so many other societal issues, and that while I could help one individual, if I could actually help to shape and shift some of those societal issues that were impacting on an individual's health, perhaps I could make a bigger difference. And the policies, the practices, the environment in which people's lives take place have as much of an impact on their health sometimes as what we do in the healthcare setting. So I felt like, again, if I wanted to make a difference and help the largest number of people I could, I could continue to work one person at a time and have my patient be an individual, or I could have my patient, if you will, be a community, uh, a region, a nation, and sometimes even a world. So I shifted to, the population health, which is public health, which allowed me to think more at the level of populations as opposed to individuals, hoping that I could help to create some of the population impact that could ultimately also help individuals.
And you spent a lot of time with that. I mean, you spent 20 years with the Centers for Disease Control, 10 years at the Gates Foundation. And most young people don't quite understand, I'm told, the importance of long-term commitment in order to achieve a goal. And yet this is so necessary. What would you say to people, and what kept you going, if you don't mind me asking, for
Yeah,
all that time?
sure. And I was at CDC for 20 years and Gates for 5. And while I was at CDC, I probably had 10 different jobs, including two times where I was on loan to other agencies. So, I was able to do a variety of different things, even though it was in the context of one organization. And I went to the CDC originally on a training program that was 2 years, thinking I would stay 2 years, but instead stayed 20 because I recognized the role that CDC can play and the influence that it had in the public health arena. And I realized by being at the CDC, I could actually perhaps have greater influence because of the role that it plays for the nation and for the world. And I had the opportunity to do a variety of different things and have an incredibly fascinating career. So, I know that young people do think about their careers in different ways, and sometimes you can have an impact on an issue from a variety of different venues. But I think thinking long term about what's the impact you want to have, how do you think about staying with something long enough to actually see the fruits of your labor, I think is an important thing as one thinks about building a career.
Let me ask you, the CDC has certainly been in the news a lot today, and not always in a positive light as a result of the pandemic. Yet we both know that it plays an amazingly important role in our ability to get through it. But I guess some Americans may have lost faith. How much confidence should Americans have in the Centers for Disease Control?
Well, the CDC is an incredible organization. It's over 60 years old. It's created in, I think, 1945 or 46. It's an organization that, like all organizations, has grown and changed over time, but it continues to have some of the brightest, best, and most committed public health professionals of any place in the world. Still today, if the World Health Organization wants an expert with some of its toughest issues, it turns to the Centers for Disease Control. If other nations want to solve some of their public health challenges, they turn to the Centers for Disease Control. So I think, the CDC is remains an outstanding organization that is a world-class organization that people continue to turn to. I think this has been a challenging time at a time when we have seen across our government institutions not necessarily getting the kind of support that they need, and people internal to the government questioning the role of government institutions. Nothing wrong with having people who want to make sure that we're continuing to improve our nation's departments and organizations, but I do think it's important to recognize the expertise of an organization like CDC and give it the support that it needs to continue to be excellent and be a resource to the nation and to the world. So I think some of the challenge has been in the last few years that CDC has not gotten the support it should to be able to continue its vital mission.
And we would both agree that we're going to need the CDC to be strong as we deal with this pandemic. How do you see? Is there a relationship between the work you did with HIV/AIDS and the pandemic that is worth sharing here today?
Our current pandemic.
Yes, our current
Yeah,
pandemic.
well, I think there are clearly parallels. One that continues to concern me is the disproportionate impact that it has on communities of color. We saw the same thing with HIV, and just like HIV, we should have known it sooner. All of the same factors that put people at risk because of their social status, the jobs they work in, the lack of access to health and health services, the lack of access to information about health. All of these factors played out in HIV, and they're playing out now even more rapidly with COVID-19, as we see Black and Brown communities being the most impacted, having the highest number of cases, but also the highest numbers of deaths.
When I look at your work at the Trust, it looks like you all have begun to do some work specifically on that, that maybe wasn't necessarily part of your portfolio before, but you've shifted to make sure that it is a part of your portfolio now. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, when I came to the trust about 3 years ago, we went on a bit of a journey to look at what would be the way in which we could have the greatest impact for the Chicago region. And, when we step back and look at all the different issues that were impacting Chicago, not too dissimilar from many large cities: violence, lack of access to quality education, health disparities, life expectancy gap between communities, etc., we recognize that at the root cause of these issues was the wealth gap and the lack of economic equity, and particularly as it applied for African American and Latinx communities. Chicago is a community that is one third white, one third Black, one third Latinx. So that means you have two-thirds of your population being held back by lack of economic opportunity, and that's having an impact on the whole region. So we believe that if we could have a sustained impact on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, we could have an impact not only on Black and Brown communities, but on the economic future for Chicago as a whole.
That's great. And for our listeners who don't know, tell us about the Chicago Community Trust, which is a community foundation, and about community foundations for that matter. I'm sure that there are a number of people listening who've Never quite heard that term before.
Yeah, and until I got a call from a headhunter to come and look at a job for a community foundation, I must admit I didn't know a whole lot about it myself. I'd worked in a private foundation, I had been on a board of a private foundation, but I really didn't know a lot about community foundations. And I am now a total convert. I think they are incredible because in some ways they're like the best of both worlds. You are an organization deeply rooted in your community, in the issues, in the people of your community. And so you're able to provide resources directly to communities, but you also interact with donors, with people who want to invest in their communities and want to figure out how can they put their dollars to invest in their communities in the ways that can make the biggest difference. So you're right in the nexus of donors and communities and being able to bring those two together in a way that I think is really powerful. So we have a large base of donors who trust us to use their resources, invest their resources widely. And then we have a large group of particularly nonprofits that we support who work in areas that we think can make a difference. So it gives you the opportunity to be close to community and help work with those who have resources to put those resources to best use.
Yeah, and I will tell you that when I look at your goal, your strategic plan has set up this thing called the Moonshot, the Chicago Moonshot. I mean, I think about foundations, and they usually try to play it safe so as to be able to very easily demonstrate what they've done and what they've accomplished. But there's nothing particularly easy about this particular moonshot goal of yours. So I would love for you to talk about that and how you're doing with it.
Well, I think you're right. We didn't choose an easy topic, but we chose something that we thought was so core and so foundational that if we, along with partners, because no one organization is going to do this alone, but if we can help to move and align efforts in the same direction, we feel like we could make a big difference. And so we've set out our goal as a 10-year goal because we believe that it took decades and decades to create this wealth gap. It isn't going to be solved overnight, but I think if we give ourselves enough time to start demonstrating what are the ways in which you can have impact. And we've looked at the closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region and kind of divided it into three different streams. One, how can you have impact at the household level? Two, how can you drive investments into disinvested neighborhoods so that those neighborhoods actually have the opportunity for creating economic viability? And three, how can you help raise and lift the voices of community so that they have collective power and are able to help to be part of the solution as we look at rebuilding neighborhoods? So household level, neighborhood level, and community level. And we have a series of initiative within each of those streams that we think together are what is going to help us to demonstrate the ability to have an impact on the racial and ethnic wealth gap.
Well, that's as I said, that's a pretty bold goal. What is the extent of the problem in Chicago and in the region?
Well, not too dissimilar from what the rest of the nation. If you look at wealth and in distinction from income, people focus a lot on income. And yes, there's an income gap as well, wage gap. But income and wages are kind of a slice in time. Wealth or assets are really what determines one's outcome and outlook. What you have, the assets that you have determine whether you can send your children to school, whether you can buy a home, all of those things, whether you can start a business and create more wealth. So we really put a focus on wealth versus
Mhm.
income. If you look at across the nation, white Americans own about 85, 86% of household wealth, blacks 4%, and Latinx 3%. So 85% of all wealth in America is owned by whites. So, if you start from there, you recognize how large the gap is. In Chicago, for every dollar of wealth that a white family has, a black family has about 1 cent, a Latinx family about 8 cents. So this wealth gap is large and growing, and we know that, and I could throw out lots of statistics, but we know that the wealth gap is not only large, but it's growing. But if we could change that and help to shift that in Chicago region alone, it would it would add $4 billion to the economy. On a national level, closing the racial wealth gap is estimated to would increase GDP by 4 to 6% annually.
Wow.
So, we're talking about large numbers, and recognizing that, if we can make a difference in this, it doesn't only help Black and Brown Americans, it helps all Americans, because we will increase the economic engine, we will increase our economic growth. We are holding back our economic growth because we are denying economic opportunities for large swaths of our population. It's not only not the right thing to do, it's also just not the smart thing to do.
Yeah, so one of the big challenges I've always imagined with creating a more inclusive society is a sense that some people will believe that in order for people of color to win, that maybe white people have to lose. And listening to you describe the potential that we achieve with racial equity and inclusiveness, it seems that everybody can win.
Well, I think everybody can win, but I also think we have to make some decisions about particularly policies that can make a big difference, because while there are a lot of things that we can do as a foundation or as organizations to help to create change, at the end of the day, the biggest lever for change are policies. And we know that bad policies, things like redlining, for instance, played a huge role in creating the racial wealth gap. So it does mean that we have to think about other policies, tax policies, expansion of things like earned income tax credit. There are a lot of other innovative solutions like creating baby bonds that allow young people, particularly young people from poor families, to have money deposited into an account that is interest bearing, that allows them to accumulate wealth so that by the time they're 18, they have $50,000 that would allow them to go to
Mhm.
school. So, I think there's a lot of different ways in which we need to think about, our taxation policies, other public policy that would be able to help to close the racial wealth gap, in addition to some of the things that we can do at a more local level.
You want to talk about some of the local things? I think these ideas nationally make a heck of a lot of sense. Many of us who are African American live in communities that were the result of redlining, and our properties don't seem to be worth as much, even though they are
Right.
just as nice as everybody else's. So that would certainly be one on a national level. But what could we do locally that maybe you all are pursuing?
I'll give you some examples. So, small business creation. We know that small businesses ultimately are the biggest employers, across the nation. But we also know that, many small businesses are started from loans from friends and family, or easy access because of former banking relationships. If you're a small business owner, Black and Brown, without family members who can provide you a loan to continue to expand your business, or you don't have a prior lending relationship with a bank, you don't have the same access to capital as a white small business owner. So, we're working on building both the capacity supports to help small businesses be able to get through some of the red tape and issues that they need to start businesses or to expand them, and then also working with lenders to think about what are the ways in which they can make it easier for a Black or Brown entrepreneur to have access to capital. Home ownership, again, another way in which people have traditionally gained wealth and assets, looking at ways to increase opportunities for home ownership. And as you said, also looking at the neighborhoods where homes are owned to help to increase the net value and worth of those homes. We're also looking at the other side of the ledger, the debt side. We know that debt disproportionately impacts poor communities and often communities of color, predatory lenders, discriminatory fines and fees. So we're working on changing the debt equation as well. So those are some of the kinds of things we're looking at that can help people with home ownership, entrepreneurship, decreasing debt. We're also looking at how to have career pipelines for young people who may not have had the right opportunities to think about getting into jobs that are well-paying, long-term career jobs. So we're also looking at job creation and income. So those are some of the sorts of things we're trying to do to look at increasing incomes, building assets, reducing debts, and other things that can help with greater financial security at the household level.
You mentioned that you certainly can't do this alone and you're engaging nonprofit partners. How do you go about determining, which groups to work with to do this work? Part of my job at the Wise Giving Alliance is to sort of vet charities to make sure that they're trustworthy organizations. I imagine you have, your own criteria to make sure not only that they're trustworthy, but they're the right partners to engage in the kind of work you're doing. I'm just curious about how you go about identifying those.
When I mention partnerships, it's multiple types of partnerships. So we work very closely with other foundations, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
We also work very closely with the business community because private sector has a huge role to play in the work that we're doing. So we look at partnerships of others who can align with us, who have
Mm-hmm.
resources to bring to the table. And that's a large part of what we're doing, is really how do we align with others who have interest in the same areas and help to join our resources together to make a difference. We're also then, of course, working with a lot of nonprofits who are in the communities that are our largest focus. And most of these are organizations who we have worked with for decades. I mean, we are a 105-year-old institution that has very deep roots into the community. So we're really focusing a lot on community driven organizations that are headed by Black and Brown people themselves, working in the communities, who have trust those communities. So, for us, it's very important that as we work with communities and work on community empowerment, that we have organizations that are trusted by those communities and who have a track record of working with them.
How are your donors responding? I know it's so important to get people to contribute their own resources to making your mission a reality. Yet I would imagine not everyone is completely on board. What are you doing? How are you making a case to them to support your work? And how are they responding?
We've been fortunate, I think, because we have a very strong and long standing good relationship, and we've stood by the community, all of the Chicago community. We've been a major civic player for over 100 years. We're trusted. But I think in addition, as I said earlier, you take a region like the Chicago region that is a third white, two-thirds Black, a third Latinx. And again, if you make the argument that we're not moving ahead because we're keeping two-thirds of our population behind, that's economically, that's a pretty powerful argument. People
Yeah.
start seeing that this is not just about social justice, which we believe it is, and importantly so, but it's also economic sense. It's math. If you do the
Mhm.
math, you can't continue to move forward if you're keeping two-thirds of your population from realizing their economic potential. It hurts all of us, and we see it show up in all sorts of ways, whether it's violence, whether it's excess death, whether it's lack of high quality education. You can't move a region forward when you're holding this much of its population back. It becomes everybody's problem, but it can also be everybody's solution.
So it's still early in the process, but are you seeing any signs of success? What are your metrics telling you? What are you seeing right now? Are we heading in the right direction?
Frankly, we launched this a year ago and then COVID happened.
Hmm.
And the economic downturn that is occurring as a result of COVID, which is disproportionately impacting communities of color, has not helped. And so one of our areas of focus now is to really double down even more on the issues related to the wealth gap, because it's only going to be more pronounced as we come out of COVID and come into economic recovery. So we're really putting a big focus on making sure that as we focus on economic recovery, that we're looking at equity as an important lens, and making sure that we are putting a big focus on how do we make sure that communities that were already economically fragile and have been really hard hit by this are not left further behind. If you look at the recession of 2008, while the rest of society rebounded, Black and Brown communities were actually worse than when right before the recession. So we don't want that to happen again. And we're looking at making sure that this recovery is an equitable recovery with a big focus on the communities that were most hard hit.
Yeah, I think about young people and their education stalling as a result of the pandemic, not being able to go to school and not necessarily having the assets at home to continue their education effectively, and what that will mean as we come out of this. It can be quite daunting to think about.
It can, but I think that there are things that happened as a result of the CARES Act and some of the situations that we've had to adapt to that I think could be lessons for the long run. So in Chicago, for instance, as our students had to transition to online learning, we quickly accelerated work around the digital divide because so many students were in areas that didn't have access to internet. They didn't have computers. So we were able to work with internet providers to actually get hotspots in neighborhoods that didn't have access before. And now this is something that can continue on the long term. And it helps not only the students, but their families who didn't have access either. So, I think that there's things coming out of this experience that hopefully we will continue. If you look at things like unemployment, cash in people's hands, protecting part-time workers. There are a lot of things coming out of the CARES Act that I think could serve as models for how could we, in the long run, invest in communities where there's been disinvestment.
So, what can people do who want to play a role or help?
First of all, I think people can get educated, become more knowledgeable. One of the things that has been very gratifying as we developed our strategy around the racial and ethnic wealth gap, we all read a lot and we learned a lot. I learned a lot. I thought I knew a lot about some of these issues, but I think just having a basic foundation in what the facts are. How did we get to where we are today? What are the factors that impacted communities, and what are some of the solutions that people are looking to? So I think one is just getting educated. Two, I think spending some time volunteering in neighborhoods that may not be your own neighborhood. There's this notion that people talk about, get proximate to the issue. Actually understand how people's lives have been impacted, and be willing to get outside of your comfort zone a little bit, and get to know people who you might not have otherwise, and communities that you might not have otherwise. Volunteer. As we always say, give of your time, treasure, and talents. There's many ways that people can make a difference, either through their dollars or through their time and their talent. So I just encourage people to do whatever they can do, but the biggest thing is getting started.
Well, Dr. Gayle, I really want to thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the success in the world to try to get this done in Chicago. I really believe that what you're doing in Chicago could potentially be a model for many other places around the country that are experiencing similar types of challenges. And so we are really hoping for you. We're praying for you. We're pulling for you in Chicago. And again, I just thank you for a life of service, and especially now for what you're doing to help us think our way through and work our way through this real challenge that people of color are experiencing. You have a reputation for getting things done, and so we believe you will here as well.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much for doing this and all the podcasts that you do. I think being able to get the word out is clearly an important part of how we can all do our part to create positive change. So thank you.
You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbsgive.org, and we hope you'll join us in our next episode. Thank you.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. Send your comments and ideas to Nona at thusmarket.com. That's Nona at thusmarket.com. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.